Welcome to A Case for America. I am Austin Hepworth. I'm here along with Michael Hepworth, and we are talking about the Constitution again. Today we are looking at the 18th and 21st Amendments that kind of go hand in hand with prohibition. And before we get into this today, it's probably helpful to remember a little bit of where we come from as we look at these things. If you're watching this, you can see the picture. If you're just listening, it won't be visible, but we have anarchy on one side, tyranny on the other. If they're like a balance beam, liberty is somewhere in the middle. It's the balance because we need laws to pull us out of anarchy, but we also need morality. We need private solutions to fill in the gap on some problems in society or issues. Because if there are laws that go to address everything and every problem, we end up in a state of tyranny where laws govern everything. And so that puts us in an interesting place as we talk about prohibition and look at some of the underlying issues, because we still have a lot of the same debates percolating today that surrounded this. So if you look at a little bit of the history, the 18th Amendment came along, I believe, 1919-ish. And there's actually a large group of women that worked very hard during this time to speak out against alcohol and what they felt were the ills of alcohol. And they had created a national movement and created a lot of discussion, and eventually were able to get the constitutional amendment passed to ban alcohol throughout the United States. Now, I do think it is helpful to look at perhaps the actual text, because it wasn't a complete ban on alcohol, but it says, after 1 year from the ratification of this article, or this amendment, it says the manufacture, sell, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof, for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Now, an interesting thing about this one is that the 18th Amendment expressly gave Congress and the states concurrent power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So any state could choose to make its own laws to enforce it. It could have its own alcohol agents that go and get people, and the federal government could as well. And so there's not too many things that Congress and the states are given express power to regulate together, but this was one of them. And so this amendment comes into being, and we get to a place in American history where you can't just run down to the store and buy alcohol. Now, if you look at history, a lot of people say this amendment just didn't work. There were, speakeasies, they'd call them. There were all kinds of places you could go get moonshine. You could go get illegal liquor in quite a few locations. Now you can look at pictures of federal agents taking large amounts of alcohol and pouring it out in the streets or the gutters or different places. And so there definitely was alcohol seized. There were people arrested. But from what I can gather of history, Congress didn't put a ton into enforcing it, and the states didn't either. And so the chance of getting caught if you were doing things illegally with alcohol wasn't super high. And so to me, it's not fully fair to say that the amendment didn't work, because it seemed pretty clear that those in power weren't super interested in enforcing it. Which, of course, if you're not enforcing a law, it's very difficult for the law to take effect. So come 1933, after about 14 years, there's a pushback, and people say, look, this is a joke, let's repeal it. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the way that this was repealed, so this comes up in the 21st Amendment, and the 21st Amendment does directly, it says, the 18th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. So boom, that one's out. But Section 2 says, but even though that's repealed, the transportation or importation into any state, territory, or possession of the United States for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors, in violation of the laws thereof, is hereby prohibited. So this section did two things. It allowed states to still choose to regulate or ban alcohol. It also, from a federal level, prohibited another state from transporting or importing into that state alcohol or intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws of that state. Because if it was just a state, if it was just, let's say Utah came out and said we don't allow alcohol, then those in Colorado could say, oh, we'll just, ship it on in, kind of thing. And there were ways the states foresaw, I think, that could be circumvented, especially smaller states back east, where it'd be pretty easy to do. And so this section was a pretty strong nod to say we're going to take the regulation of alcohol from the federal level and we're going to kick it down to the state level. So states can choose what they do or don't do with alcohol. But once a state chooses, other states can't mess with them on it. So interesting in the ways of amendments, the way of distribution of powers, to say we will fully respect kind of what you choose. So we saw this play out a little bit with the Roe v. Wade decision, where Roe v. Wade for a time was a federal constitutional right. The Supreme Court said that no state can violate it, go against what they say with Roe v. Wade and abortion rights. Eventually, the Supreme Court overturned that and kicked it back to the states. We do see, though, that many states and businesses and others set up ways to try and get around the laws that other states put into effect, where they say, hey, we'll fly you to our state, if you need an abortion, come on in, kind of thing. And the states are pretty open about trying to attack what the other states are doing. Again, I think they foresaw that with alcohol because there was so much contention around it in the United States. And so they passed this Section 2 of the 21st Amendment to say, you can't do things against what that state has said that they want. And so to me, there's a number of interesting questions that arise out of prohibition. Questions, again, that we're still addressing today. One question that we probably won't go into too much, but I think it's a real interesting thing to think about, is whether or not the government has the power to ban things that are used in religious ordinances or that are deeply connected to religion. So, for example, any church that uses sacramental wine and that drinks it as part of their sacrament, should the government have the power to ban a religion from using sacramental wine? Now, that question's come up with drugs. There are Indian tribes that smoke certain hallucinogenic drugs as part of their religious rites and ordinances, and some of those drugs are banned by federal law. And so, and again, the question is more, should the government be able to ban certain things like that? Or would religion just present then a loophole? You just form a church if you want to smoke cocaine or take cocaine, and then you just have a religion that consumes cocaine and you have an exemption to it. It's an interesting question. But I think that as we look at some of these, as we're trying to find this balance point to say, what should the law regulate and what shouldn't it? Some of the other questions that come up with prohibition are, to what extent should the government be telling us what we can and can't consume? Should the government be involved in saying, you can't consume this, it's bad for you? Or maybe they're not saying it's bad for you, maybe they're saying it's bad for society. And does that create a different scenario or not, if you can prove something's bad for society versus just bad for an individual? And we're currently dealing with those types of issues with things like drugs. We still have a lot of people that say we should just legalize drugs because we're fighting this war against them. It doesn't work. People can get them anyways. We're filling up jails with people that are choosing to consume things. And who are we to tell people what to do or not to do? And so that is one of the big pressing questions. We run into issues of things like smoking. Should the government be able to ban a parent smoking in front of their child, for example? Should the government be able to say, you're a property owner, but you can't choose whether people can smoke in this building or not because it's a commercial building. Where does this balance start to fall? And then as we look at it, and even as you look at the 21st Amendment, the 18th Amendment, the 18th Amendment expressly banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. So you have the question of, well, what's an intoxicating liquor? Are there alcohol that may not be intoxicating? I don't know. Or at least maybe we should say could be argued to not be. And then the other thing is said for beverage purposes. And so this again could be another one of the potential weaknesses of the 18th Amendment is that you could still make alcohol for hospitals. You could still make alcohol for cleaning purposes, washing purposes, medicinal purposes, possibly. And so could people, for example, could they argue that, well, I can purchase alcohol if I'm buying it for cooking or for cleaning? And it goes to kind of a fundamental question of due process. How much does the law have to spell out in order to ban something? And when something has multiple uses, how difficult does it become to regulate it? And we're starting to see that a little bit with medicinal marijuana, where it becomes questionable about what can we regulate with it, because if people are using it medicinally and some recreationally, how do you start to distinguish those? And the lines can become very blurred when a substance or a product has multiple uses to it. And to what extent can you regulate, ban something for one use, but allow it for another? So Michael, curious at the outset, what thoughts you may have on alcohol, prohibition, or if you have any other questions you'd like to add to what we'll be discussing today.
I like to go back to what would be the purpose. If we're saying let's ban alcohol, what are we trying to say? Are we trying to prohibit its use? Are we trying to protect, as you mentioned, does it do something in society? Does it cause harm to society? Are we trying to protect other people that aren't using it? Are we trying to instill some sort of order? I like to go back to what are we trying to accomplish when we create a law? Are we using the law as a deterrent for something? Are we using it as a protector? Are we using it to restore order? And maybe we're doing, parts of each. But for all laws, are we using it for one of those purposes? Are we trying to protect what we believe to be inalienable rights? Sometimes that helps clarify a question for me if I can figure out perhaps the purpose of what we're trying to do. In that, if you say we're just trying to protect people from harm, then you start to ask the question, should you protect people from harm, all harm? Is that possible? Is that something that should be pursued by a government? Deterrent, some things are certainly a deterrent. Can you deter everyone from doing something? Has that ever worked with any law? Are there laws out there that no one ever breaks because they're so afraid of breaking them because it's a law? These are the kind of questions and things I consider when I look at these laws. What's the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? And is it something that government should really be pursuing? Is it within their purview? Should we make it within their purview? Or are we, as you kind of also asked, are we getting too much in government telling people what to do? How much right and autonomy should you maintain? And then lastly, the question is, what part does morality play here? I think we've acknowledged many times that for the point of freedom and liberty that we're trying to achieve, it takes a balance between laws pulling us out of anarchy, but societal morality to keep us from tyranny. And so if we've just decided that society has lost all moral value and the only way to maintain order is through law, then that means the regulation of everything, and of all your actions, which tends towards tyranny. So I think the question we need to consider here is, what role does morality play here? Is there some point where we say we can't fight all of this with a law? We also need to fight this in our society, in our communities around us, just with private solutions or in the choices we make as far as morality goes. I think we have to consider what role morality plays as well.
Yeah, and I think it's on that note about morality and alcohol. I've seen a number of articles lately that talks about the upcoming generation, the up and coming generation, the 18 to, I don't know, 25, 27-year-olds, somewhere in there. They're not drinking anywhere near as much. They have kind of this morality that's among them. I'm not sure where it's come from, but they don't drink anywhere near as much as other ones did. And there's actually a real impact to the alcohol business, to tourism that relies on alcohol sales and things. A lot of these people travel, but they won't drink when they're traveling. And so a number of articles have started to talk about how places are really trying to change what they offer. Far more bars now have alcohol-free drinks because there's so many more people that drink alcohol-free. And so it is interesting to look at, some level of reckoning to say, yeah, at what point do we step in? At what point is it appropriate to or not to? Because you look at groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and I think that they have a very solid argument from a moral perspective to say, hey, look, we lost children, we lost family members due to the results of someone being drunk and out of control. And we know that when people are drunk, they don't have full cognition to control everything completely. Now, the law still imposes on them the obligation to be responsible even before getting drunk and things. And it is illegal to drink and drive, even with prohibition repealed. But we know that people will still drink and drive. And then there's harm that happens and people are injured. And we certainly could reduce a lot of that harm by banning alcohol. And so it is interesting. We live in a world that is very opposed to a lot of harm taking place. There's law after law that comes out that wants to stop any form of harm possible. For example, Utah just passed a law that mandates that any organization that regularly has 25 or more kids get together, they have to take the driver's license of every adult volunteer or every adult employee and run that information against the sex offender and kidnapper registry. And the goal is to help kids not be harmed as much. But in doing so, they are making it so that normal good people who, maybe run a youth group or something, church group, whatever, they're trying to do something good in the world, they can now be in violation of the law because they didn't collect someone's driver's license or check a database or something. And so we're trying to stop this harm to children by forcing otherwise law-abiding citizens to do things and creating penalties associated with it if they don't. And again, this isn't me weighing in on whether it's good or bad to want to protect children from these types of things. It's more to say that as a society, there are some very strong pushes to stop all harm. We have zero tolerance policies of bullying and different. But as a society, we radically, strongly tolerate the harm that comes from alcohol. And if you look at the stats on it, some of the things that these women talked about that helped get the 18th Amendment passed, they talked about how many marriages were destroyed, how many women were beaten and abused by drunk husbands and fathers, how many children were abused. They talked about a lot of family issues that bleed into societal issues. They talked about obviously the people that die, the anger issues that come up, all kinds of different things. And not to say that every drunk person gets angry, but in general, it becomes harder to fully control these emotions and different things start to happen depending on people and who they are, and different states they may have inside them. And so these women made this argument and presented it. And we still, again, see these playing out today to say, well, we tolerate alcohol, but we ban cocaine. We tolerate tobacco, but we quasi-ban marijuana. That one's kind of going by the wayside. There's been a lot of push to legalize different forms of marijuana. And so in this, as we look at this and say, okay, what is the proper balance? Where should the law step in? Should the law just step in and say, oh, something bad happened to a kid, so boom, it's gone? Or should it be, yeah, we've had 50,000 car accidents this year from drunk drivers, so too much. If it was only 49,000, we'd allow it. 50,000 is too much. And some people say, well, one's too many. And we see pushes like that with child products. If there's a crib and a child dies, and then a second child dies, they'll recall all the cribs nationwide, generally. And it can be millions of cribs for a couple deaths, which I'm not making light of at all. It's just to say that then we don't treat alcohol the same. We don't hold it to the same standards as some of these other things. And similarly with things like guns, people can talk about it there. And so we get, again, just this place of really pushing to say, what is it we value? How do we determine what the rights are, what they aren't? How do we get to the point of understanding these types of issues?
And just to piggyback off of that, the percentage of homicides that are due to or committed by someone who's been drinking alcohol or has recently or got in an argument with somebody else who is drunk, the percentages are 50-60% of those are they blame on the influence of alcohol. Same thing with sexual assault. In somewhere between 70-80% of sexual assaults or rapes, one party or the other was under the influence of alcohol. And these are areas that we put a lot of emphasis on in society that need to get cleaned up. And no one's talking about alcohol as it relates to these areas. And if you want to make a big impact on deaths in the U.S., alcohol, if it was ceased to being used, would make a larger impact than just banning of all guns. And then the same thing with rape. The number of those that would go away is just astronomically high, but we don't really talk about it when it comes to alcohol. It's like it's the uncomfortable one in society. We tried that already. We don't want to go down that road again. But it seriously causes a lot of harm in our society today.
Yeah. And this is where I think it gets really interesting to say, to your point about, well, what are we regulating? Are we doing it because we're saying, oh, as an individual, alcohol is no good for you. You're going to get liver cancer. I don't want you to have that happen. Or are we saying, whoa, this causes so many issues for society. There's so many innocent people that suffer that we have to act as a society, put some laws in place, or else it's more of an anarchy type state. And I believe, from what I can tell of these groups that push for prohibition, they put a very large case for the societal harm of alcohol. And again, it's a very difficult thing, I think, to break America out of. If people are used to drinking, they have the recreational drink. One of the problems with regulating it with an outright ban is that there were many people that drank responsibly. There were people that could drink and not turn into wife abusers or child abusers or criminals. They wouldn't drink and drive, and they'd go out and have a good time and then come back and have their right or whatever in place for them. And so we certainly have a scenario now where people are saying, look, don't restrict me just because there's others that can't do things responsibly. But there are a lot of others that it can create big issues. And when you look at the number of deaths and the number of crimes where alcohol's a component of it, or where drugs are components of it, it becomes very interesting to start to say, wow, at what point does society have a right to step in? You know, if I look at things like, you know, so here's a question to ask: should the government be able to regulate what I put into my body? Should it be able to tell me no? I hear people say, no, you should be able to put in whatever you want. And now, on the flip side, some people also want the government to force people to put certain things in their bodies, like vaccinations. And some people push back and say, no, the government can't tell me what to put in my body. And so somewhere in this scale, you know, people on the vaccination side, some will say, well, we have to. There's this big societal threat. There's a sickness that can kill a lot of people. If you get vaccinated for it, you know, as the claim goes, you'll save people's lives. Now, people will contest that. They'll throw up stats that support it. There's all kinds of things in between. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that there was some disease that came out where it's very clear if you could vaccinate, you know, 95% of the population, you could stop the disease and people would stop dying. They can show that there's a very big societal harm if people don't, you know, certain groups of people or whatever that will die. And so, is there a right for the government to require a mandatory putting something in your body? Or again, to go back to the religious question, what if you want to consume something the government says you can't? Or you don't want to have something in you that the government wants to put in you? These start to become very interesting legal issues from the perspective of saying, we really need to talk about what principles help strike these balances. Some people will say no to everything. Some will say yes to everything. I don't personally believe it's that clear cut as to no to everything or yes to everything. I look at things like heroin and cocaine, and I personally feel very comfortable saying, I think those tip the scale, and it's okay for the law to ban those. We get into things like smoking, and you know, I don't love smelling cigarette smoke when I'm going somewhere. And admittedly, I smell a lot less of it now. I think a lot more people are vaping, and I don't smell anywhere near as much smoke as I used to. But we do know that smoking can have impacts on people that aren't smoking. I remember going into a restaurant once in Michigan a number of years ago and was quite surprised that people were smoking in it, and realized that not every state had the same clean indoor air acts. Here in Utah, smoking in a public building is illegal. And that's a law that's been in place ever since I was a kid. I've just kind of grown up expecting that that's the way it is. But when you start to think about it, you say, well, as a property owner, should I have the right to put up a sign that says smoking is permitted in my building? So only come in if you're okay with cigarette smoke. And from a property rights perspective, it seems to make some sense to say, let the property owner decide. But then you get the situation of, well, can parents take their children into those buildings? Well, can parents smoke in the car with their kids? Can parents smoke in front of their children? And we get quite a few different answers in society. And so on these questions, I feel we often debate whether we should or shouldn't, but I don't, you know, for example, whether we should or shouldn't smoke in front of our kids. People will talk about those things. I don't feel, though, I haven't seen a large societal debate or an ongoing one about what the principles are that should drive this. And I think that prohibition to me represents a stab at saying, let's address societal harms, and then kind of recognizing, this is a lot to bite off at a federal level. Let's kick it back to the state level and let them decide. And today we're at a place where, at least as of 2017 or so, there were 154 dry counties still in the United States, which means 154 counties still don't allow alcohol to be sold within the county. Quite a few counties, in my opinion, that still have that prohibition. There are a number of states. I think those 154 counties are distributed between 9 states. I think there's about 16 or 17 states that have a law that says counties and cities can't ban alcohol. So it's allowed across the whole state. But as a society, we've kind of let the states decide what they do or don't do with it. And that's a potential response too, is to say, well, maybe we're so close to the tipping point. You know, if we're at this balance and we're trying to decide, is it anarchy, is it tyranny, where are we at? We have it to say, well, the closer it gets to that tipping point, where there's arguments on both sides and it's hard to draw the line exactly, maybe that means it should be a states' rights issue for the states to be able to make these decisions and experiment around. And then let's see, do these dry counties have less and less crime than other counties, or do people in the dry counties just go to the county next door and buy some things and come back? Is it really changing people with what they're doing if you can still go to a neighboring town or a neighboring county and pick up your alcohol and come back home? So some of the questions to look at with it and think about. But Michael, curious, what you think some of the principles might be that we should look at in determining what the proper balance is. Where do we find this balance between what the government should regulate, what it, when it shouldn't, when it should leave it to people, that type of question.
Yeah, I think your point about as it gets closer to that tipping point, start to localize. I think as these issues become difficult to draw lines and they become hotly contested, it makes sense to start to push it down so it's closer to home. You push it down to your state, you have more recognition and say in your state. States could even push it further if they felt the need. There's no reason why not to say, how about a county, how about a city, depending on what the issue is. But we really should be asking these questions about principles, because if we just, so many times when a law is proposed or passed, the statement of harm carries a lot of weight. This is who it's hurting. This is how we're going to stop the hurt. And while it's certainly something I don't disagree with to try to prevent harm, there's two sides to that. The first one is, can you? And then the second one is, what further harm might you cause by trying to stop that harm? And I don't know that we do enough analysis either way. We just see a harm and say, let's stop that harm. And so we generally make a sweeping rule. And then years later, you may see other harm occur from that. Not enough analysis was done. We sometimes forget that solutions are tricky things. Many problems are created because of solutions. So it doesn't seem to be sufficient to just say harm. Perhaps we need to look into, we kind of talked about protecting freedoms, liberties, maybe alongside of that order. What does our liberty have to say on this question? What does our thought about how the government is supposed to work have to say? Harm is a great moral motivator, because it sounds like you're doing something really good, and in general, stopping harm is a good thing. But I think if we just focus on that, we miss other important pieces, and we potentially cause other harm as well. One of the harms being to move us too close to tyranny and losing a lot of individual rights and freedoms that we should otherwise have had. And so along those lines, when we're talking about harm, we're talking about keeping people safe, we should also ask, are we removing important rights and liberties that individuals should have? And at some point as a government, do we say, we're going to go this far, however that far that is, but the ultimate realization of your freedom and your safety is a combination of government action and civil action. So can the government say, we're going to go this far, the rest is up to you? Can you as citizens work together to start creating more responsible solutions? And maybe there's a back and forth there to say, we need this much from the government, and then we as citizens need to do something more, or we need to be active in how we're discussing our actions. Is it okay to behave in a certain way? Are we tolerating it, to use that word, because we fear saying something about it? Or should we stand up and say, maybe this isn't appropriate? Maybe we don't need legislation. Maybe we just need to talk about it more as a society. I think it's probably multi-layered. We need to go through, we can't just focus on harm, or we can't just focus on deterrent. It's certainly multi-layered, and we have to have the conversation kind of across the spectrum of these ideas to understand, are we removing too many freedoms, or are we allowing too much to happen, so we're approaching anarchy?
Yeah, and it's, one of the, when you talk about harm, I think it is helpful to talk about slightly different types of harm. There's obviously harm to the individual. So the FDA will ban certain food stuff or products saying that it might hurt you too much. And then there's harm that can directly happen to society, or to maybe not even to society, directly happen to others. So, for example, secondhand smoke. If there's a parent smoking in the car with a child, there's a very direct impact to that child. And so there's a harm where it's me, I'm hurting myself. There's a harm where now I could be hurting others based on what I choose to do. And then there's a harm where at a societal level, we start to experience a lot of issues and breakdowns that may or may not be able to be directly tied to it, but we're kind of, we believe that it's a part of it. So for example, that comes where the families break down or where there's abuse or different things. Can we prove it was absolutely the alcohol's fault? I'm sure alcohol, people could believe it contributed, but if an alcoholic is mean and abusive when they're drunk, do they have those feelings inside anyways? And does alcohol just magnify it? Meaning, would there be some other triggering point besides being drunk that made them become angry and abusive? And so maybe alcohol is associated with a lot of things, but doesn't mean it's the cause. And we have those questions. But again, that's a level of harm. So there's the first level, harm to the individual. Second, direct harm to another person. Third level is correlation. It appears to be part of the mix, part of the problem. And I think that something like alcohol, there's an argument that it does each. Should the government be able to ban alcohol because it might give me liver cancer? I personally say no. Just looking at that, it just feels like no. We should have a little more freedom to consume what we want. Maybe the government can force a disclosure that says this may cause liver cancer or it may contribute to it, or this product's not healthy. But from a perspective of just my health, I lean more towards saying let people decide and then live with their own consequences. Now, some people argue there is a societal harm in that because of healthcare costs that go up. And when the government subsidizes so many healthcare costs, it's then increasing our taxes. It's doing different things when people are unhealthy. To me, the response to that isn't to say that we now have a basis to regulate people. The response is, well, the government should not be paying for those things. I don't believe much at all in government subsidies. And so if that is a harm, that shows that our laws are probably off if we're doing things like that. Second level, when it comes to protecting children or something from secondhand smoke, that one I think gets closer to this line or this balance of where does it fall exactly? Because if we ban everything, should we ban alcohol completely, or tobacco completely, or should it just be illegal to smoke in front of your kids? Should we even ban that, or should you be able to raise kids around smoke? These are questions I think that have plagued society for quite some time, and I don't feel like we're at a place of having an answer to these. But it is interesting to me to watch the debates on drugs where they just say, look, it's not working. All we're doing is creating a huge societal issue of having a lot of people in jail. Let's legalize drugs. Let's just stop this war on drugs, make them legal, we'll license them. It'll be way better for everyone. And if someone chooses to destroy their life, they choose to destroy their life. But again, with that, we have all the issues that creep in of, well, what about the parents that are high while they've got 2-year-old children? What about the parents that are high while they're pregnant or drinking alcohol? And again, as a society, we've navigated the alcohol one with pregnancy by not banning alcohol, but there's a law that makes it illegal to, or shouldn't even say necessarily a law. There's a strong societal moral push. Doctors, others talk about not drinking when you're pregnant. I know in Taiwan, when I was there as a missionary, they were very expressed that you shouldn't drink tea when you were pregnant. They said that tea would really mess with things and cause problems for the lady or the baby and things. And I was always quite interested by that because the church I belong to, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, doesn't believe in drinking green tea or coffee. And so when we'd be teaching people about our beliefs, they'd often push back and say, well, green tea is perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with it. I'd say, then why don't you drink it when you're pregnant? So if it doesn't do anything bad, why don't you drink it when they're pregnant? And most people would stop and say, well, I haven't thought about that. I don't know. But again, to my knowledge, it's more to say that green tea, they can find health benefits. They've done studies that say there's health benefits to it. But there was a very strong societal norm that if you're pregnant, you don't take green tea. They felt that hurt the child. And that norm was very strongly enforced, where there was a very strong morality where people would just say, nope, I'm not going to give you green tea. You're pregnant. Here's something else. And so it is to say there can be some very strong societal pushes against these things. And I actually look at it and say maybe it's one reason why this upcoming generation is choosing not to drink. Maybe we have had a lot of discussions about it. Maybe we've talked about it as a society. And people are saying, I don't really want to make that decision. And the morality is shifting. To me, we can certainly push conversations. We can talk about things. We can start to enforce things as a society. Again, where it's, just us saying, I'm going on a trip. Anyone coming with me? It's going to be a dry trip. We're not going to do alcohol. Let's go camping together, but no alcohol, please. And we as people can start to do things like that. We have the power in most of the states to push counties or cities to regulate alcohol or do different things with it and to really work to strike the balance. And I believe that's kind of the approach America's taken is we're going to try and strike the balance on what's proper and what's not with alcohol. And I believe that's part of the American way is to do that. And so when I look at something like the FDA, I'm not a fan that the federal government is telling us across the entire country what we can or can't do. I say, well, maybe treat it like alcohol, kick it to the states, to the counties, to the cities. Let them decide if there's something that's so egregious or so against their morality or something that they believe is so harmful. And maybe let others choose to open it up. And we even see, I look at that debate playing out in places like San Francisco, where they moved for a while to not be as tough on crime. In San Francisco, the crime got really bad. They weren't arresting people for certain things. And now people are pretty sick of it. And there's a strong wave coming back to say, let's get tough on crime again. And these experiments come and go where groups are trying to strike this balance. But I believe that sometimes, no matter how forward thinking we are or how much we can prophesy or predict the future, sometimes we just don't know until a place tries it and they can see what happens. And so one of the amazing things about America, I believe the system we have of the states and the federal government is that the federal government had limited powers. And in general, that meant that we gave power to the states to do things, to go try and strike this balance. If they went too far out of balance and were tyrannical, people could leave the state. They could move to other places. And with COVID, we've seen quite a few people exercise their rights to move and go to different places. And it's changed the economics, it's changed the political structure in a lot of communities. We don't fully know the extent of it yet because the census was a 2020 census. A lot of the moves still continue to happen after that. And I think by 2030, we'll have a better idea for where kind of the movement of people ended up with COVID. But there was a lot of movement, a lot of things that took place. And I don't have a lot of heartburn over living in a country where something's legal in one city but not in another. And where there are more states' rights and the federal government's making less decisions for people because people decide more things for themselves. And so maybe someplace like Las Vegas would legalize all drugs, and maybe someplace like Tennessee would ban them or something. But if we could operate from an approach that alcohol has, where you have to respect what the states do, you can't try and circumvent them, I think it'd be a very interesting place to put a lot of these debates so that they could play out, people could articulate them, and we could talk about them a lot more than we do where the federal government has all the power to say yes or no to a lot of these things. But again, these are me fascinating experiments, fascinating things that took place. I'm still quite fascinated, honestly, that we have 154 dry counties. And there's people that live in those, and maybe some people choose not to live in those. Maybe some people choose to live in those because of the fact they're dry. But that is part, I think, of what it means to be an American, is to take responsibility even for where we live, where we associate, what cities we move to, what cities we don't. And then also having a voice in our local communities. That's all part of our moral responsibility to contribute to ways to try and strike this balance that we talk about, where we have to pull out of anarchy, but we do need to stay away from tyranny to keep America at its best, where there can be the most freedoms and liberties for people to really grow and thrive. Michael, curious if you have any final thoughts or other things you want to throw in.
I think that sums it up pretty well, where we like the idea of more localized control in a lot of these things. Sometimes we're trying to push all our solutions to the federal government. That just results in a consolidation of power and makes it harder and harder for things to change and for us to. We're here saying we don't really know the answers to a lot of these questions. And so it's good to have a lot of different places to try to feel it out, try to make good decisions. And you can do that at the state, the local level. You can start to see what works, what doesn't work, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. One of the questions we can ask when we ask a state or a federal government to pass a law is, what is their ability to enforce the law? If the requirements to enforce it are so invasive that it takes away your liberty, maybe you're asking the wrong question. And so having these experiments, being able to have these discussions is important. And too often we just lead it down to, well, the federal government should or shouldn't, based on, as we said, harm, just a general definition of harm. And I don't think we're talking deeply enough about it. And if we can bring this down to more local levels, we can have better discussions and try kind of experiment, see if we can figure out where a proper balance is to keep our freedom, keep our safety, keep our order, keep all those things in balance.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I know I've talked to people that are concerned about letting other people choose wrong, what they believe is wrong. And so they do want kind of a federal approach. They want a winner take all type approach. And to me, I go back to saying, well, why can't we have a Las Vegas and some dry county that is very morally upright and things? We don't all have to be Las Vegas. We don't all have to be the perfect saintly town or whatever. Because there are very different things that people do push for and that they feel are appropriate or not appropriate. And a lot of them are based on beliefs, which isn't to say that they're not valid. It's just to say that sometimes we have to let them play out and see what happens. And there's certainly the role for people to, I'd say, prophesy and say, hey, if you do this, I believe these effects will come in. If you turn our city into Las Vegas, we're going to see destruction of families. We're going to see a lot of misery, a lot of homelessness, a lot of, whatever. And people can choose to do that, but it really forces us to kind of go and do homework to say, well, what can we support? What can't we support? How do we talk to people? How do we help them see? And with all the data we have nowadays, again, it's not necessarily makes the job easier, because we'll argue over data differently. We'll pin, we'll assign causation to things, have correlation, even if it's not necessarily the real reason why. But to me, it's part of this grand human experiment where all humans were trying to figure out the proper way to do things. And I think that the founders were very open to this notion that, hey, that state may go crazy and decide some wild things, but federal government, stay out of it. And to me, on these substance types of issues, the states have been pushing back. We see that with the medical marijuana. But so to me, it's starting to kind of come back to this, where people are saying maybe the federal government's not the right one to make the decision for us, and let's bring it to the states. And like you say, Michael, one of the benefits of that is we have far more ability to have a voice here at the state level or the county or city level. We can work to change things so much easier than if it's stuck at the federal government. It takes an incredible amount of work to get the federal government to change its stance on marijuana, or on some substance they put on their controlled substance list. But you have a lot more sway at the local levels. And I guess one other thing we didn't throw out, I'll just throw out at the very end, one other consideration is, with addictive substances, are there checks and balances that are necessary on corporations? Because they can make a ton of money off getting you addicted to something. And so there is this question of, is it fully someone's choice about what they do? Or should we be looking at the addictive power of corporations? And that principle is playing out extensively right now with social media, where there's a big push to ban social media for youth, for example, because it's addictive. We generally ban addictive substances for kids unless it's caffeine. We let them drink caffeine. But for the most part, the law says we need to give people a chance to be able to decide things. But when you mix money and the power of addiction, do we need additional checks and balances in place? And we won't go fully into that. But I think during the Prohibition era, they saw there was a lot of money at play, a lot going on, and a lot of power that money wielded during that time too, to fight back against Prohibition. And I think money will always have a sway in how these things play out at both the federal and state levels. And so even if you were to localize it, you may need some additional checks and balances in place to ensure that a local corporation doesn't buy out the city, the city council or something like that. But those are some of the considerations that, as we go through, we'll keep talking about, especially with corporations, because there is a certain power to money. I'm not saying it's a full power, but there's a certain level of power there. And it may be necessary to consider what checks and balances are appropriate to keep us in balance so that we don't go too far off on either side of things. But we appreciate you joining us today to talk about these two amendments, the 18th and 21st Amendments. And we look forward to talking with you more on future episodes. Thanks so much.